Well, it's taken 84 episodes and almost 5 years, but the Wookie has finally driven a Miata. I honestly don't know how it's taken this long for me to finally drive a Miata. Not just for the show Wookie Drives, but to actually sit behind the wheel of one and have a go. I don't know how I've gotten this far in my almost 30 years of life, but there's always a time for firsts. But here, finally, there is one. A 2000 Mazda MX-5 Miata of the NB generation. This is an example of the second generation of the car that many credit towards saving convertibles in the affordable sports car. The spirit of the 60s British sports car, yada yada yada. I'm sure you've heard it all before. One would say that this is another one of those quintessential cars, in regards to being an affordable sports car / roadster. I've driven a few quintessential cars this year, being a hot hatch, a premium compact executive sports car, a lifted wagon, and the mid-sized dad sedan. So it's fitting that I finally get a go in a Miata this week. If you're watching this video, I'm sure you've probably heard the story many times before, so I'll try to sum it up relatively quickly. The Miata idea was first floated by Motor Trend writer Bob Hall to Mazda's lead engineers, Kenichi Yamamoto and Guy Arai, that the small, inexpensive British roadster was becoming a rare breed, and someone like Mazda should build something in its place. This was around 1976. Well, by 1981, Hall was now the head of product planning for Mazda USA, and by 1982 had convinced Yamamoto, now the chairman of Mazda Motors, to give him the green light to go forward with such a project. 3 different design philosophies would be proposed by the 3 teams. Hall's Southern California team championing a front-engine rear-drive design like the old British roadsters of the past, while the 2 Japanese teams favoring either a front-engine front-wheel drive or a mid-engine rear-wheel drive design. In the end, Hall's Duo 101 design would win out, and soon Mazda's design studio had gone as far as acquiring a vintage Lotus Elan to take many design cues and philosophies from. By 1985, a run-in prototype with a fiberglass body, codenamed V705, was running around Santa Barbara, California, and was gathering up all sorts of positive reactions. V705 contained the 1.4-liter 4-cylinder from the Mazda Familia, and used a lot of Mazda parts bin parts. On January 18, 1986, Hall finally got the word that he had been hoping for almost a decade. Corporate had greenlit the production on the small, inexpensive roadster. And this was in the face of an increasing pressure and uncertainty that the convertible would be a viable model to continue selling for many manufacturers. News agencies and government watchdogs were doing their best to convince the public that convertibles were dangerous, and yet here Mazda was, out here trying to convince the world that the convertible was here to stay for the long run. The Mazda MX-5 Miata was introduced in 1989, and it set the world ablaze. Weighing in at just 2,070 pounds, Mazda had truly rebirthed the spirit of the lightweight British sports car. Using the credo Jinbo Itai, which translates loosely in English as rider and horse as one body, Mazda had created something special. Mazda and the design team used this phrase and developed it into 5 core design requirements for the Miata. That the car be as compact and as light as possible while meeting global safety requirements. That the cockpit accommodate 2 full-size adults with no wasted space. That the basic layout continue with the original's front, midship, rear drive configuration, with the engine positioned ahead of the driver but behind the front axle for 50-50 weight distribution. That all 4 wheels be attached by either wishbone or multi-link suspension systems to maximize tire performance, road grip, and dynamic stability. And finally, that a power plant frame again provide a solid connection between the engine and rear-mounted differential to sharpen throttle response. Of course, the NA MX-5 Miata was a smash hit and would become Mazda's signature product. Yeah, you had the rotary sports car of the RX cars, but they wouldn't have the lasting cultural impact that the Miata would have. The NA Miata would win Automobile Magazine's Automobile of the Year for 1990 and would land on Car and Driver's 10 Best list from 1990 to 1992. Of course, a success like the Miata would of course spawn a second generation, the NB, in 1997. Borrowing design cues from the FD RX-7, the biggest change with the NB would be the changeover from pop-up headlights. With pedestrian crash standards becoming more stringent in the late 90s, the design feature that was inspired from the Lotus Elan would get the axe. Despite this, the NB was slightly more aerodynamic than the NA, with a drag coefficient of 0.36. Of course, it was slightly larger than the NA, as well as more powerful. Another big change was the optional ABS, which wasn't available with the NA due to Mazda trying to make that model as simple as possible. As mentioned before, the NB would be more powerful, with the 1.8-liter BP4W producing 140 horsepower and 119 foot-pounds of torque. Compression ratio was also increased from 9.0 to 1 to 9.5 to 1, with slightly domed pistons, and Mazda introduced their new variable intake control system with the switch from long and narrow at low RPMs to opening up the intake to short open at higher revs, allowing for the best flow in both situations. Of course, the 4-banger would be hooked up to a 5-speed manual or 4-speed auto. Like the NA, you had independent suspension front and rear, but the NB would improve the design with larger anti-roll bars at both ends. What you end up with is a devilishly fun little car. Even at over 150,000 miles, this car is a blast to drive. The Miata isn't outright fast, but its lightweight and fantastic suspension tuning makes it a blast to hit the corners at speed. And with its tiny size, with a wheelbase of just 89.4 inches, the sense of speed is greatly intensified, which adds to the overall fun and experience. Couple that with an incredibly easy clutch and smooth shifter, it just feels right. Sure, it isn't a speed demon, and it takes a little bit to get up to cruising speed, but that isn't the point of the Miata. Small, lightweight roadster. Shut up about it being underpowered and sail it into a corner. Slow car fast at its absolute best. It's a fantastic little car to be driven hard. My biggest regret is not having the opportunity to experience the, Miata experience earlier. I highly recommend it, and there's a reason why these are among the de facto enthusiast cars. They're fun, they're cheap, and they take a beating. My only real gripes are just the disappointment that I know that I would never own an NB due to the fact that I'm simply too tall for one. No, not like that. I actually fit surprisingly well in the NB Miata. Like, seating position for the most part is fantastic. I'm just on the outside edge for not being too tall for the windshield. The GoPro does exaggerate that by sitting above my actual sightline. No, unfortunately, the number one hiccup for a tall, fat Wookie like me is the non-telescoping steering wheel. Like, I can get in the car and close the door perfectly fine, but to operate the clutch, I'm just using the movement of my ankle instead of my whole leg. One really doesn't put into stock how much you actually move your left leg while operating clutch. But with the door closed, my knee is just kind of trapped behind the wheel and the door. When you're stuck with just the movement of your ankle, you really think about that for all 10 minutes of the drive. Unfortunately, this one little detail is why I can't own one of these cars. If the wheel telescoped towards me just a hair, then maybe this wouldn't be an issue. But as a stock NB Miata, that's just the one major ergonomic issue that I have. But if you're not 6'3" and 265 pounds like me, or at least under those numbers, then an NB Miata may be for you. Anyways, this particular 2000 Mazda MX-5 Miata belongs to another friend of the channel, George the Car Guy of Lexington, North Carolina. I've driven two of George's cars before, the W204 C-Class from episode 68, and the 5th gen Toyota 4Runner from episode 73. This NB Miata has been George's project car for the last year. He bought it for $5,400 last year when he decided he needed to move on from his old Jeep project and get into something of a budget sports car variety. And the Miata perfectly fit that bill. He installed the 15-inch Flying Miata Kogegi wheels along with the ISR full race exhaust. He's also recently had the engine fully serviced, with everything from the timing belt to spark plugs and just everything heads up. In fact, his shop buddies were impressed with how clean the top of the engine looked with everything was apart despite the 150,000 miles. Mechanically, the only real issue is that there's a slight exhaust leak, which is why the check engine light's on. So despite as well and as good as shape this car is, it's just a shame we have to get to the elephant in the room concerning this particular MX-5 Miata, the paint. You see, when George bought this car, it had a fresh coat of paint on it. The problem was, the owner had taken it to Mako, whom apparently had forgotten to give it a clear coat. So, as the past year had marched on, the red has deteriorated to the point of looking like this car had been abused its entire life. It's a lesson in you get what you pay for, and it's unfortunately the next owner that's going to have to pay that price. Poor George is currently shopping around independent paint shops to eventually get the Miata properly painted. So that will be addressed hopefully soon. But it's a major thing that he didn't think he'd have to address when he bought the car. Yeah, it was a cheap paint job, but it looked great when he bought it. The decay of the paint, because clear is apparently too hard to apply, has been an increasingly larger and larger thorn in his sides not long since he originally bought the car. Paint is something that isn't cheap. Yeah, a budget place like Mako may seem like a deal, but there's a reason it undercuts a proper body shop. That reason, this time, is apparently skipping a very major step in painting a car, which protects your long-term investment in the paint and the car itself. Paint aside, this is a very fun little car, and George loves it for that reason. I can see why, as the Mazda Miata is one of those quintessential cars in their respective category. The Miata was hugely important not only for Mazda, but for the auto industry and car enthusiasts everywhere. The MX-5 Miata proved that a small, affordable two-door roadster was something that buyers were clamoring for. Yeah, the RX-7 was cool with its rotary engine, but that car came with its own challenges due to the very design of its engine. Here, you not only had an affordable sports car and convertible that was fantastic to drive, but it was also reliable and relatively cheap to maintain and fix. Like I mentioned before, the Miata has become so important for Mazda that it even outlived the very rotary RX cars that stood atop its pantheon in its lineup. Once again, I am kicking myself as a car person for not getting the opportunity to drive one of these cars earlier. Even if it's not the car for you, like with me having fitment issues around my knee, it's still an experience I highly recommend every car enthusiast to try out at least once. 2000 Mazda MX-5 Miata, a quintessential car that helped save not only the convertible, but it also proved that the cheap enthusiast cars were worth the risk for auto manufacturers everywhere. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you once again for watching another episode of Wookie Drives. Once again, huge shout out to George the car guy of Lexington, North Carolina for letting me drive his NB Miata for this video. If you have a car or truck you'd like to see the show and happen to be in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, feel free to email me at wookiedrives@gmail.com. That's right, submit your car by emailing me at wookiedrives@gmail.com. That's right, submit your car to wookiedrives@gmail.com. Don't forget to give the video a like, drop a comment with some feedback. Any feedback is good feedback. Any interaction with this video really helps this video in the algorithm. Share with all your Mazda Miata friends. And finally, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, hit that bell for more Wookie Drives like these. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good day.
This transmission is coming to you. You got it. You want to go?
The 2000 Mazda Miata.
You got it.
It's waiting.